So as a continuing part of discussing the actual accuracy part of performance ratings, again, to focus on simply are we measuring what we think we're measuring, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the cognitive process of what is necessary for someone to be able to complete performance appraisal ratings, and then some common errors and common ways to train around those errors that we can use in the performance appraisal. So the cognitive process model for performance appraisal basically illustrates how difficult it is to do subjective performance appraisal. The idea here is that at each one of these arrows is a potential place for error to occur. So in order for you to do an accurate performance appraisal as a rater, as a manager, as a boss, as someone that's being called on to basically come up with a numerical rating of someone's performance, the first thing is you have to actually observe the behavior. So if you're not being able to observe the behavior, if you don't have a considerable part of your time where you're getting to see how your subordinates are actually behaving, you're not getting feedback on what they're doing, it's hard for you to be able to accurately come up with performance appraisal numbers. Assuming that you actually have a chance to observe the behavior, the next step is you have to actually encode information about that behavior. So that means that if you see behavior, you need to be able to actually recognize it as this is actionable behavior. This is the behavior that I'm wanting to look at. And again, recognize that you may have missed important behaviors in the observation phase. So the encoding information phase, sometimes you might see behavior and you incorrectly label it as either poor performance or good performance when it wasn't. So for instance, if an expectation of performance is that someone is very safe on the job, and you're watching the floor at a manufacturing plant and you see someone that looks like they're going through safety procedures, so you encode, that person's being safe. However, if you were closely observing it, you'd recognize that they weren't even where they were supposed to be in the first place and had violated quite a few safety protocols to be where they were at. So that's the idea of encoding the information. So just because you observe it doesn't mean that you're encoding it correctly on whether it's a positive or negative behavior. Once you've actually observed the behavior and properly encoded it as either positive or negative information about performance, the next one is how long do you store it? So storing information is about how well you actually store the information once you've observed it and recorded it, and also are all that you're storing in your memory actually relevant behaviors. Now it's time later past the observation, so you observed some behavior, you encoded it, you stored it into long-term memory. Now 2 weeks later it's time to do performance appraisal. The next place where there can be errors in the process is the retrieval of it. Can you actually now recall that stored information? And finally, once you've recalled all the information that you can you actually integrate that information into an accurate appraisal of the person's behavior? And a part of this includes also, are you able to factor out your previous attitudes and feelings of that employee that could cloud the judgment? So a lot of this can be actually addressed in organizational training. So a lot of times behavioral observation training, and we'll talk about this a little bit later in these slides, is an active attempt to basically get past those first two. It's about how to observe behavior, taking time to observe behavior, and knowing ahead of time what is good and bad behavior for proper encoding. The middle one, store information, one of the best things that we can do there is just to strongly encourage managers to write these things down, to not rely on human memory to hold all of this information, to keep files, to keep records, and again, documentation of behavior that allows at the end, once it's time to retrieve and integrate the information, less chance for error. So industrial organizational psychologists will often use this cognitive processing model of performance appraisal to first identify where is potential problems in a performance appraisal system, but also how to address those problems and increase the accuracy again of performance appraisal. So another way that industrial organizational psychologists look at this idea of increasing accuracy is to look at common rating errors. And here's the ones we're going to talk about. And there are some others, but broadly, these are the ones that are most likely to occur when we're looking at performance appraisal, especially if we're assigning numbers to that performance. Halo error refers to the fact that a good performance appraisal system will usually have multiple dimensions. We're not just asking rate their overall performance on a single scale. We're often asking about key components of their job. So for a faculty member, it would include items about research and research quality. It would include items on teaching and teaching quality. And it would include items on service and service quality. Halo error is when you rate all of those highly because they're succeeding at one important trait. So, for instance, if a manager highly values research, if they know the person they're evaluating is one of their top researchers, they might rate all of their traits, research, service, and teaching, as high. That's halo error. Leniency basically represents when a manager is basically rating everyone highly on all of their traits. Central tendency error is when managers are rating everyone at about an average rating, and severity is when managers are rating everyone lowly. And we'll talk about each one of these in turn and why they're a problem. And then there's some additional biases, including discrimination and biases that are related to ethnicity, gender, national, basically anything we have stereotypes about can result in bias in the rating. So halo rating, a rater's tendency to use a global evaluation of the rater and then making all the dimension-specific ratings. So in other words, what this means is this is when a rater is basically being a little lazy. They decide what they think about the employee broadly, and then they apply that rating to all of the dimensional specific ratings. Now, this may still end up giving you a pretty accurate evaluative rating of the employee. In other words, if you really want to know, is this a top-level employee, that information may be retained. But if you're wanting to use performance appraisal information for developmental reasons, this kind of error means that you don't actually have any strengths or weaknesses. You're rated the same on every single dimension, which makes it very hard to develop off of halo error. It can also be defined as a rater's unwillingness to discriminate between independent dimensions of a rater's performance. So again, it can also be driven by not only the use of global evaluations inadvertently, it can also be a purposeful decision to be lazy in the performance appraisal system. Now, the problem with halo error is there is such a thing as true halo, and it's trying to identify when you've got halo error, someone is being rated highly across the board because generally they're thought of positively, compared to true halo, someone's being rated highly in all dimensions because they are legitimately, accurately good amongst all those dimensions. And there is research that shows there's usually fairly high intercorrelations between performance dimensions. You do find some people have strengths and weaknesses, but usually your top performers are usually pretty good at most of the aspects of their job, and your bottom performers are likewise poor at most of the aspects of their job. Leniency is the mean of raters across ratees is higher than the mean of all ratees across all raters. What that means is think about it this way. You have a company with 5 departments, and each department has a manager making ratings. If in 4 of those departments the raters are being accurate, they're giving some people high ratings, some people moderate ratings, and some people low ratings, and one rater gives every single one of his employees a high rating, the mean of that rater is going to be higher than the mean of all ratings across all raters. So the mean of the raters is higher than the midpoint of the scale. So generally what happens here is the rater either wants to look good, look, my department is doing so well, wants to be liked, he wants to not have to tell anyone they're doing poorly, or possibly is just doing it so that he can avoid any conflict with any of the people in his organization that he is directly, or she is directly supervising. So that's leniency error. And again, the problem we have to often look at is there is also such a thing as true leniency. So the first question we would ask is that department actually substantially more better than the other departments? Is it actually more productive? Is it making more money? Does it have more clients? Because maybe it is that all their employees are that much better. But more likely, it's probably a manager doing some form of rating error where they're rating everyone highly. And again, that means we can't trust the decisions we're making, and also we're not getting really usable developmental feedback. Central tendency occurs when raters only use the midpoint of the scale. So in this case, the rater is rating all of his employees or her employees as just meeting expectations. So again, why do they do this? Sometimes the raters are just lazy. Think about it. If you're not really that interested in doing performance appraisal, if you give people very low ratings, you know they're going to come in and complain. If you give people really high ratings, they're going to ask why they aren't getting promotions. If you give everyone an adequate, boom, you're kind of done. It's not, you don't have to differentiate between the good performers and the bad performers, and they're less likely to complain. So, in addition to just being lazy, the rating scales we use tends to promote a bias towards the middle. So most of the rating scales we've been talking about, the midpoint usually means you're doing your job. You have to work hard to either be a failure at your job or work hard to be really good at your job to get above that midpoint. So this is, again, the normal distribution where a large percentage of employees should fall to begin with. The problem with central tendency is when all of the employees are falling in this range. And finally, there's severity. So this is the only option that's left, but it's when raters use only the low end of the rating scale, or they consistently give lower ratings to employees than any other raters. Again, why? Raters sometimes, in this case, want to maintain an impression of being tough. Sometimes they want to keep employees from getting too cocky. And they sometimes think that this is a way to motivate employees. The idea, if I tell all my employees they're underperforming, they'll have no choice but to work harder to overperform. So these are all called distributional errors, and why they're called distributional errors is they cause an error in the distributions. What we're expecting from performance appraisal distributions is a nice normal distribution. Most employees should be somewhere in the middle range of getting their job done. A few employees should be truly excelling, and only a few employees should actually be underperforming. So leniency, central tendency, and severity are these distributional errors, and it's a mismatch between the actual and expected rating distributions. We would expect that in all things being equal, in any random department or random group of employees, there should be a few that are doing really well. There should be most of them that are doing their jobs pretty good, and there should only be a few that are really having problems. So the chief problem with these errors is the first thing is range restriction. The ratings do not discriminate in any way, shape, or form. We can't actually make decisions from these ratings, and we also can't trust them for developmental employees. The other problem is that all of the employees are being lumped together, either in the bottom, the middle, or the top of the distribution. So not only makes it hard to make personnel decisions through this range restriction, it also ultimately tends to affect employee morale. The good employees feel slighted, and they feel as if they're being treated unjustly. No matter where you fall, if everyone's being rated in the middle, again, you're rewarding poor performance because you're still rating it as adequate, and you're punishing good performance because you're not acknowledging it. Same thing happens when you have leniency. Again, the poor performers are also being rated high. You're rewarding poor performance. And the top performers are being seen as no different than anyone else. You're ignoring good performance. And finally, in severity, everyone's being punished, which includes your good employees. Other errors that we can look at include recency error. So raters heavily weight the most recent interactions and observations of the ratee. So again, going back to that cognitive process model, because if you're looking at an observed behavior from months ago, the chance of that observed behavior having been encoded, stored, retrieved, and integrated is much less than a more recent behavior, which is much more likely to still be in memory. So if you have raters that are relying purely on their own memory, you're probably going to find recency error. I used to actually use this to my advantage without even knowing it existed way before I even went to college. I used to work at a place, and I noticed that the owner, the manager, would about every 2 to 3 months start to kind of pay more attention. So what this looked like was, it was a small little store. There was only 2 or 3 of us that worked at any time, and most of the time, the person that owned the store wasn't even there. He allowed the store to be managed by his employees. But about every 2 to 3 months, he'd show up for about a week and just be in the store. He'd be in the office. He'd be wandering around. I quickly realized that that's when he was doing performance appraisals. So whenever that happened, I worked my ass off. Pardon my French, I worked my rear end off to make sure that I was being noticed as a top performer. And it worked. Every single time, about a week after he did this, I got a raise. I was the only person in a year and a half that ever got a raise there, because that's the only time he was looking. But it was also recency. He was thinking about performance appraisal, so he was now gathering that information. First impression or primacy effect is not necessarily the opposite of recency, but it refers to the fact that we also have a tendency to pay more attention to our initial experiences. So basically, this is telling us that in that broad spectrum of performance appraisal, if the person doing your ratings immediately either has a positive or negative impression from you at day one, that is likely to be encoded and paid attention to at the end when they're doing performance appraisals. along with any recent behaviors. And finally, similar to me error. We find across the board, and study after study has found this, small effects of similar to me. And what that means is that raters tend to give more favorable ratings to raters that are more like themselves. So if your boss is a white male, middle-aged and middle-classed from the Midwest, and that describes you very well additionally, you're probably going to get slightly higher ratings based on the similar to me. If you are a young African-American female from New York City, from a very affluent household, you'll probably get lower ratings from that person. Now again, these are not the differences between this person actively discriminating and giving some people 1s and 5s. It's small differences, but those small differences can make a big difference when it comes down to actually decision making. So how do we actually address these problems? Well, the first one is using rater error training, RET. It focuses on describing these errors and showing raters how to avoid them. And if you want an example of what rating error training looks like, you just went through it. So this module is rater error training. It's going through the very common mistakes and how to look for them, but it would also include some examples of actually ways to avoid it and ways to recognize it in your own behavior. If I was actually doing this as a training just for an organization, we'd probably also do some role plays and have some examples and a test at the end. It's been found that rater error training, or RET, does reduce errors, but accuracy is not necessarily improved. It really depends on the type of error. But what it does do is it generally means that if you have multiple raters rating multiple ratees in an organization, that they're more likely to rate people in a similar way, and that is a good thing. A more popular form of rater training is frame of reference training, FOR. It focuses on not necessarily the errors, but simply enhancing the rater's observational and categorization skills and establishes a common frame of reference. Sometimes FOR will be combined with bars, so one of the ways it creates an established common reference is to create behavioral anchors for the ratings. But it also sometimes will work outside of including it with bars, of just basically having the raters all come in and talk about what does a 1 on this scale mean? What does a 4 on this scale mean? Again, it's giving people a frame of reference for what these numbers mean and look like. It also focuses very much on that cognitive model we opened up with, so kind of that cognitive model of the 5 steps for encoding information about performance appraisal. It enhances the rater's observational and categorization skills. And usually it improves appraisal accuracy, especially when combined with behavioral observation training, or BOT, which really again focuses on that observation and cognitive categorization skills in managers and raters.